Good evening, everyone. My name's Jude Philp. I'm Senior Curator for the Macleay Collections at the Chowchak Wing Museum. And tonight we're here to have another annual lecture in the Being Collected series with Matt Poll. Before I start, I would like to warmly acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, and to pay great tribute to their elders of the past, to the leaders of the present and those emerging in the future, to all that they do for us and for caring for the country in which we live. I also want to pay great acknowledgement and respect to the new group of Indigenous curators who are changing so much of our museum landscape in Australia at the moment and overseas. It is such an exciting period to be working in museums because of the tremendous knowledge and creative knowledge sharing that Indigenous curators are leading in terms of exhibiting their culture through museum structures. So tonight we'll hear from Matt Poll, who recently left the Chowchak Wing Museum to take a new post at the Maritime Museum. We wish him the very best there. I'm sure he'll do great things, as he has done at Chowchak Wing Museum, and as we will see in this talk tonight, where Matt will look at back on some of the work that he's done through both the Macleay Museum and the Chowchak Wing Museum. Thank you very much again, Matt, for agreeing to be on this side of Being Collected rather than on my side of hosting. And thanks. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Jude. It actually is quite different being on the other side for once. It's a little less stressful. Yeah, it's great to be back with the Chowchak Wing crowd tonight. Thanks so much for everybody for logging in tonight. It's a beautiful stormy weather out here on Wongal country. I'm out in Western Sydney. We use the term Wongal, but when you look at some of the other place names that we know, there's such a much more detailed map of the landscape that's been overwritten by the urbanisation of Sydney. It's just been an incredible honour for me ever since I started with the Macleay Museum, as it was back then, to go on this learning journey, to just to find out so much more about places that I'd walked across so many times before, but to see these deeper layers of history underneath it. Even when you look at this map on the other side that I've put up on the screen, a more detailed map of the greater Sydney region, which I pay my respects to as well, and all the lands of the Eora Nation. Not just sites of occupation, but sites of resistance, places where people were occupying land in those early days of the colonization of Sydney. And you can sort of see people didn't just easily let go. There was huge resistance. And the work that so many other curators and colleagues and friends that I've worked with over the last few years has just been incredible to see. It seems every year we get better at, not just acknowledging country, but acknowledging the true history and the deeper history of where we live and where we work and where we spend our lives. I'd also like to acknowledge the incredible work of the predecessors of myself who worked at the Macleay Museum collection over many, many years. The Macleay Museum, for a number of years before I started in the position, was in the very incredible capable hands of Miss Rosemary Stack. It was her work that I actually continued and built upon, and I could not have done any of the work that I would be switching through tonight without acknowledging just the incredible groundwork that people like Rosemary and a number of other non-Indigenous curators have given, not just their work, but their passion to justice and their passion to telling the real history of Australia. This is another example of Rosemary's work, which I still used right up until the last exhibition that I worked on, Ambassadors. This book Collected, which was published around 2000, and there's a shot of the exhibition in the old Macleay Museum, which highlighted a lot of the items which were singled out in the collected book and the accompanying exhibition. Was in many ways the forerunners to Ambassadors. I'm a strong believer that, even museums don't own these objects. They are morally the objects that are owned that belong to and are in many ways made by the hands of the ancestors of the contemporary community members, who are one of our primary audiences when we're working with material culture like this. So it's just, I think it's really important to not just acknowledge the country, but acknowledge those who came before me, working in the role that I worked in with Macleay Museum. I'd also like to jump a bit around tonight, but also show how, you know, as a curator, it's never one person. I feel incredibly lucky. I was putting this list together, and I think I've got the names and the years right of all the speakers who have been a part of the Being Collected program over the 11, 12 years that I worked with the Macleay Museum Chow Chuck Wing. And I can pretty well point to each one of these Being Collected lectures and match that to the curatorial philosophy or the story that we built into the contemporary way that we reassembled these collections. You know, they were assembled in many ways before I certainly worked with them. And, you know, the most heartening thing for me is to imagine all the different ways, you know, for many generations to come, that people will actually be, you know, reassembling these collections again, reconnecting them, reconnecting the knowledges, you know, treating these objects with the respect that they deserve. It's an incredible privilege to work with museum collections. Before that, I'd worked with Bamali Aboriginal Artists Cooperative, which is a, you know, commercial art gallery of sorts, where we would, you know, throw up shows every 3 to 4 weeks. We'd be literally finishing the labels the night before the opening. A very different experience compared to the more careful and in some ways cautious way that we approached these objects, which were acquired in complex and very different historical periods. You know, the difference between contemporary art and working with historical museum collections is that there's just so much more that needs to be built into the way that we not only as curators approach them, but that we take a proper account of the cultural safety of audiences as they approach them, because there's dangerous stereotypes and different ways that these objects can be reassembled. And we know this through some of the ways really early 20th century publications have used these objects in the collections that sort of reinforce really negative stereotypes of the past. So it's not just myself. One thing I've been really adamant about through the ambassadors program was that it wasn't just the conversations that we sparked and community members generously gave to us while we were working in this space, but there was more than a century of conversations that took place before them. And it was incredibly crucial to do justice to that story. And I thank all of the previous Being Collected speakers for giving me a little piece of the puzzle, which I was able to sort of build into the contemporary story that we ended with the ambassadors, and also with the Jalkari exhibition in some forms too. I'd also like to acknowledge when I started in 2009, a project that was well underway was the Makargama ARC research project, which was led by Dr. Joseph Gumbala, an incredible man that I look back now and just feel so incredibly fortunate to have been able to just meet, more so than watch him engaging with collections. And coming from a contemporary art background, he really opened my perspective in so many sort of ways. He was assessing bark paintings initially, but the final project that was guided by Rebecca Conway and Jude Philp as well, and I literally came in 5 minutes to midnight before the opening, to assemble an exhibition which changed so much of my thinking. When I look back at it now, it's a long-term project of how we were able to listen to and be guided by Dr. Gumbala's incredible foresight in terms of exploding the idea of what a bark painting was, you know, merging our natural history collections and other items from other parts of the university. His honorary doctorate in ethnomusicology, which he was awarded, is the least recognition, because it was a recognition in the university context, but it also was reinforced by later community members who we engaged with, who told us, flatly that we needed to recognize the professors and the teachers and the artists and the people in the communities and the different roles and the protocols that they have in terms of how they recognize themselves and their responsibilities to each other and to country. And even though a lot of it went over my head when I first started working there, so much of those initial conversations that I was incredibly privileged to sit into have infused so many other aspects of my work since that time. I was able to, through my experiences with Bamali as well, tap into some Sydney-based at the time community members to initially start off with the existing Macleay Museum education program as we had at the time. People like Mr. Jeffrey Samuels, who's been an incredible mentor to me, and this is another photo of Mr. John Blair as well, showed me that there's a really important role that education programs play in terms of having Aboriginal people bring their own perspective to the way that Aboriginal culture is taught. You can write labels and you can do different things like that in terms of signposting information for people to direct them towards further sources of information or sources of knowledge. But it's absolutely not the same as the living story that people bring and their perspectives. I've worked with a lot of people who in living memory, lived in the assimilation era, who were themselves members of the stolen generation. The change that has taken place in their own lifetimes is something to be constantly aware of and, and sometimes in awe of, in terms of their resilience and still willingness to be generous, in terms of they feel a responsibility themselves to be the custodians of their knowledge. And it's what also guided so much of my work as a curator, in terms of stepping back a little bit, learning when it's okay to ask questions, when it's okay to try and learn a little bit more, and other times when it's not okay to do that, and to build an authentic Aboriginal community voice into the way that we tell the story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia is thankfully today a little bit more taken for granted than it was. And I think there's so much more strength that universities and university museums are building into the cultural competence of how we actually not just teach Aboriginal students and audiences, but bring them into the process of learning and teaching alongside us where possible. So back in 2009 and early 2010, I guess, one of the first sort of exhibitions that I wanted to do was, Bamali is a cooperative for New South Wales-based Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists who are, based in the city. And so I was in my own learning process, learning about these historical collections of New South Wales artifacts. So one of the first exhibitions we were fortunate to put together was called Outlines, which in some ways is just a word which referenced things like the shapes of petroglyphs. It was also a sort of an artistic concept, drafting and outlining something coming forward. But there was actually some really amazing ways that we worked with this story too, to actually, it was one of the first shows I worked with where we started out attaching language words to museum objects. At the time, I didn't have the resources or research capabilities to really research the specific language name for each object from the region it was, thought to be from. But we named it all in words from the Sydney language. And I'd probably give a really great shout out there to Professor Jacqueline Troy, whose book, The Sydney Language, was a great template in terms of being a starting point for testing out, a couple of these words I'd learned changed over time, and that's the dynamic nature of language. You can take a historical language list and, take it to community members, but the real test is if community are actually using that themselves and recognizing that. But there was a real simple process there to try and bring some sort of justice to the way that these objects were known, and possibly the names for them were spoken by people in the past, as being an incredibly important way of shifting the narrative away from an authoritative museum perspective and turning it back into a community authored perspective. I'll just be 1 second if that's okay. Sorry about that, I just had to move some stuff. It's been really wet out here today. So the exhibition itself was an incredible opportunity to bring community members in. It was a way that not just for the university's education program, but for other Aboriginal education institutions across Sydney. I worked really closely at a lot of the early days with places like Tranby Aboriginal College in Glebe, and also the Eora College of Arts in Redfern. This is a group of artists who were studying the Certificate 4 in Aboriginal arts production at the time. And a number of close friends in that group too, some of us not with us anymore. So I apologize for not giving a warning at the start about deceased persons who may be depicted in this presentation. But we kept the Outlines exhibition up pretty well for the entire time that I worked at the Macleay Museum. And it was the most powerful tool in terms of community engagement, because I think that's the other sort of takeaway I'd like to really give to tonight's audience in terms of designing exhibitions and shaping knowledges about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. You know, there was this real monolithic idea of, you know, the anthropological view or the archaeological view of Aboriginal culture, which was not really that well known in the East Coast region, or especially in the Greater Sydney region at the time. And, you know, when you're working, you know, Sydney has the largest diaspora of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from all around the country in it. So the amount of times that community members would come in as visitors in groups like this, or they were students, or they were different people who just generally came in as visitors and would actually add these new layers of information to the story of a particular object. You know, shifting what we thought was the language region that it was attributed to, and guiding a more accurate and authentic story was a really important part of that process. So Outlines and the other exhibition, Peoples of the Rainforest, with some Queensland artifacts, which we also used later, were both really important tools in terms of breaking down that barrier that a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have about museums as these repositories of, you know, stolen culture, for want of a better word, and repositories of a distance from their ability to know their own culture on their own terms. Self-determination is an incredibly important concept, which is applied across so many different arenas these days. But you know, some of the most joyful experiences that I could point to were people who, especially from the east coast of Australia, who just thought that there was nothing out there that sort of represented them. You know, these are artists who see the amazing legacies of places like Punyatula and the amazing bark paintings of Yolngu culture. But when you look at Greater New South Wales, there's at least what we recognize today is about 70 different language regions, and each of them has their own specific and unique special sort of artistic motifs and legacies and different things like that. And I felt incredibly proud to be able to continue that work that I was doing at Bamali in terms of giving people a space to tell their story on their own terms, and connecting it back to this incredible opportunity to not only start their own journey in discovering that there actually is quite a lot. I mean, we know these days too that a lot of it is held in overseas museums, but that's a different story too. Another amazing opportunity which came out of Outlines was a very early opportunity to bring an artist such as this case, Roy Kennedy, who also has passed away just earlier this year, and match his work to some Wiradjuri artifacts. And when you look at the etchings that he produced of the Warringasta mission where he grew up, and sort of see the line work as it was also detailed on like the parrying shield in this little section of the Outlines exhibition, and the other sort of painted surfaces and the way that the line delineates so much more. There was I look back on it now, and it was just actually just so fortunate to have made all these other connections and be able to sort of use those connections to keep building on the story of the objects. You know, the objects really took a life of themselves in so many different ways. And, you know, the broader university art collection was another opportunity that I worked on quite early. So working with co-curator Katie Yule from the University Art Collection. One of the first shows we did was a show called Freedom Riders, which was a really great opportunity to bring that story of the universities and the students for Action on Aborigines role in the 1965 Freedom Rides, a couple of years before the big anniversaries hit. And I think we were able to do that at a couple of different times. One of the ways that we were able to sort of forward program what sort of collections and items and, you know, what communities we wanted to engage with was through sort of looking a little bit ahead to actually see where conversations might be going in a couple of years' time. And there was an amazing recreation of the Freedom Rides by contemporary Aboriginal students, which started, the bus took off from the exact same spot, which isn't that far from the entrance of Chow Chuck Wing Museum either. And we worked with several amazing works in the University Art Collection and some other contemporary artists like Black Douglas, Carla Dickens, Jonathan Jones. There was a few artists in that exhibition who at that time certainly didn't have the really great profiles that they did now, but were also bringing their stories of how the history of activism had shaped so much of their own artistic journey and their learning process. So the Freedom Riders exhibition was also one of the very early opportunities that I was able to sort of build into my learning experience of working with the Macleay collections. And, you know, it's amazing today to sort of see how, especially in museums and art galleries, that museum objects and contemporary artworks are a little bit interchangeable. The big Encounters exhibition, which exhibited into 2016, you used a lot of contemporary artworks almost as labels, as ways of sort of seeing an interpretation of a historical object in the language and in the voice of contemporary artists who are interpreting those, or just responding. Sometimes it's not as literal as an interpretation. It's more an artistic response. And to highlight one of the other amazing being collected speakers, Nadi Simpson, who was an incredibly formative person in those early stages as well, who with her project, The Spirit of Things, you know, would engage with objects, but then would sit back and, you know, create poetry and writing and songs, particularly to author this different sort of response that didn't try and be literal in the way that it depicted the past. It really reaffirmed and reasserted that living agency of contemporary community members. And so, yeah, there's a lot of precedence to how the Ambassadors exhibition came together that we worked across over so many different years. I'd just like to give a shout out to so many different people. Some of these are from the Sydney Ideas program that was also ran at the university, and we would often be sort of brought into. There was the A-Star program for Year 10 and Year 12 students to design pathways into university for students. Very special shout out to the two ladies in the top corner of your screen there, Denise Donlan and Val Attenborough. Their work as non-Indigenous anthropologists and archaeologists shows an incredible turning point from that much more older version of anthropological and archaeological histories, which a lot of people find first when they try and engage with the ways that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture has been represented academically. But I can point to so many different circumstances where, you know, working with the knowledges and being taught to step back a little bit. There's also Robin Torrance and Peter White down the bottom corner there, who also gave us an incredible theoretical grounding to sort of show that a lot of the ideas that community members were sort of sharing with me weren't that theoretical. They were actually incredibly practical in the way that we were able to tell or to bring that agency and, to reassert the importance of the contemporary story. Imelda Davis up the top corner there, who I worked with on another of other community projects relating to the history of the Australian South Sea Islander community, for example. This is her at an event with Benita Marbo. It's an amazing Sydney Ideas panel down the below there, Stephen Gilchrist, Shani, God, I'm jumping through so many names, I'm wearing myself out. Akulchika Madden in the corner there as well, who was from a representative of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. And I'll get back to that a little bit later when I show some of the ways that we ended up with the version of the Ambassadors exhibition that we worked with. But it's certainly not the case that there aren't recognized community authoritative groups that you can bounce ideas off. Of course, it's not a matter of just demanding that they approve things. Quite, the majority of the time, the answer is no, not really. Why would you do that? Why don't you do it differently? But every now and then, through being persistent and, being sharing and listening to what outcomes would be more preferable to community members, you're able to design public programs, exhibition projects, even longer term sort of collections strategies in ways that break down that barrier that people have about museums as being keepers of culture and bring community members into ways of making them into transformative spaces of practicing culture. I really could have just gone all night just going through a slideshow of, I was, a bit snap happy a lot of times, I think, but I look back now and it was incredibly important to just capture so many of those memories of people that we met and worked with and who, really wanted to engage with the collection. People from right around Australia and the Torres Strait, and it sort of challenges that idea that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, don't want to engage with museums. They do. They just need to find more incredible more ethical and more sensible, I guess is the better word, pathways which allow them the time, the breathing space to think, to talk to their community members. I mean, one of the big lessons you learn is that nobody likes to speak on behalf of their community. Leadership isn't something that is hugely sought after. It's a burden more than a responsibility. I've seen in so many different cases. But through that willingness to assert their knowledges and using museum collections and expressing that through contemporary art, we were just quite regularly getting people through word of mouth hearing about the museum. And it's always just so exciting when you open your inbox sometimes, or you get a message on your phone to call someone back, and it's like, well, this person's in town and they've heard about this collection and they need to come and see it and they want to, and they're using it in their own cultural reclamative practices. So there was just so many different people I could see that I just can't thank enough and can't name enough really without spending an entire year or so going back and looking across all those different stories again. But to move it up, I think another important sort of story which was part of the Macleay Museum collections at the time was this University of Sydney's repatriation project. It was an incredible way of breaking down barriers. It's a bridge. There were so many times when community members would I'd contact them about repatriating objects, and at first they're very just rightfully distraught. But through the end of the process, they found ways to heal their communities. They sort of made peace with the unethical practices of the past, and were able to, go back with their heads a little bit higher and say that, we got this back from this community. This is ancestors of our lands, all across Australia. It doesn't matter where you are. Generations of Aboriginal people were born, lived, and were buried back in Aboriginal land. And it certainly wasn't the place for a museum to be holding these ancestral remains. And so I felt, one of the things I'm incredibly proud of was the amount of repatriation projects that we were able to undertake, because they're certainly not easy. They certainly don't happen quickly, but when they do finally happen, and sometimes even as a curator, I felt incredibly honored to be invited back to witness repatriations taking place. I should actually give a huge shout out there to the people from the Office of Environment and Heritage who did a lot of the logistic work over the times and actually getting the permits and, finding places where reburials could take place, reassuring community members that this is a process all the way through. It'd be for a different presentation itself to really explore the history of how repatriation bridged so many of the future conversations that were able to take place as we worked on a project such as the new Chao Chak Wing, for example. I guess a couple of years later, a big project I did was working with the stone tool collections, something I was completely unfamiliar with, coming from a contemporary art background. But I saw these collections and the craftsmanship in them, and I sort of found ways of speaking about these tools using the language of artists, for example, the sculptural form of stone tools, the sourcing of materials, the deeper stories of what they meant about land rights. I mean, you can look to the entire continent of Australia as a museum of Aboriginal land, the nurturing of land, whether it's through fire stick farming, the different sort of trade networks that existed. I was really drawn to that idea that, we weren't exhibiting stone tools, we were actually exhibiting Aboriginal land. And what we did with the Written in Stone exhibition, I guess, was in some ways just show that these quite large collections of stone tools, which were really impenetrable for community members. I know when they used to visit, there was a lot of community members who were quite fascinated with the objects, but it was impenetrable. So what we wanted to do was to actually just group, the toolboxes of different language groups. And, due to the nature of the collections, it was possible to sort of draw out these larger sort of stories of adaptation and how stone tool technologies also were very early forms of contemporary art as people used their manufacturing technologies with new materials like glass and ceramics and different sorts of things. I was just stunned really about the response to that exhibition and the way that these consultation tools, I ended up calling them in so many different ways, was another way that we could actually just tell these different versions of not just land rights, but stories of country and stories of people's knowledges, how people, survived and, thrived in so many spaces across the country. There's so much more work to do there. I really saw that exhibition as just a starting point in terms of larger discussions which have actually taken place since then. I've been incredibly fortunate to work with other archaeologists, non-Indigenous archaeologists and Aboriginal archaeologists like Dave Johnson from the Aboriginal Archaeological Association, who are tackling this issue of just what to do with the hundreds of thousands of stone tool artifacts which were displaced by agricultural technologies, for example. This is an example from one museum in one tiny town in New South Wales, for example. They just sit in this grey zone, and there was a time there right at the height of Written in Stone where we were getting like people just offering them to me all the time, putting them in the post even a couple of times, and we were sending them back. Because there's just nothing, they're just seen as too hard to work with. I think, especially for a lot of regional museums across the country, they can be great opportunities to have discussions with local communities. I mean, 99% of the time, the best place to return these collections to is to places where they were found. And there are other communities that are sort of repatriating them back to country in certain ways. which is just a fascinating sort of way to see that the different sort of larger projects that the museum was sort of involved in, such as repatriation, the language of that started to be applied back to objects, and vice versa. It just reinforces that idea that the land is an ancestor, and we can go some ways to reparations to the great upheaval of Aboriginal practices all across the country through treating these not as too hard, and bringing them into important opportunities to give authority to community members, to let them assert that authority. So jumping a little bit here, I mean, the projects that we did also led to incredibly important international engagement projects. I was really fortunate when Stephen Gilchrist was curating the exhibition Every When in the United States, for example, to be a part of a curatorial delegation made up of curators from all across Australia. We would also, relying on the Strauss Conservation Institute, who had a project at the time to look at binders and pigments in bark paintings in terms of bringing a scientific perspective towards the conservation of what were becoming very old collections these days. And there's little bits of the stories that just fed so much more into the final product that you saw with the Jalkari exhibition, for example, where people, especially in international contexts, are listening and wanting to learn and wanting to do the right thing. And I think we need to be a lot more receptive to that, because I certainly found it was the case that there's no shortage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander material culture, which it sits overseas, and curators over there know even less than what we as Australian curators need to know to do with them. Another sort of parallel project I did then was Sydney University is a big stakeholder in the Westmead Hospital precinct, and we, through various sort of projects that we were working on through the Wingara Moora Indigenous architectural statement, to be able to sit in these conversations as artists were rebuilding the story of Western Sydney back into the Westmead Hospital. This is a project that Dani Mellor, who was a lecturer at Sydney College of the Arts and a previous Being Collected presenter, produced about the story of the Parramatta River and its intersection with Toongabbie River, a 60-metre long mural. There were so many different sort of projects happening where they would sort of not need the resources of a university or want to bring us into them, but where we could sort of keep the momentum going on different projects that we had started. This is also a part of it called The Gathering Space, a beautiful work by the artist Nicole Monks, the Umaji artist from Western Australia, who was through the Eora College program, for example, looking at the idea of the river itself, but in a completely different sort of concept. This is one that I worked on with Danny Eastwood and a few other artists as well, where we used some of the momentum from the Stone Tool conversations that we'd started in Written in Stone, and his work as a heritage consultant in Parramatta Park, sort of taking some stone tools which were found in that area and scaling them up and turning them into benches where people could have conversations. I mean, all these works were installed outside the palliative care unit at Westmead Hospital. Another example of just creating those benches for conversational spaces and working with the incredible Uncle Dean Kelly, who has been involved in the reclamative projects in relation to Ngawi, canoe manufacture, and making versions of these Sydney watercraft, incredibly important objects in terms of even the economic history of the early colony of Sydney. Aboriginal people were completely unrecognised in so much of the labour that they put into not only saving people's lives as they were caught up in rivers, but just helping people cross rivers and different things like that. So we were able to build a lot of these different sort of community engagement projects and sort of act as I was able to act as a museum curator, but also sort of work outside the museum in a sense and share the knowledges and the practices that community members were wanting to undertake in their own projects, and give that sort of agency to really develop their ideas further into much more concrete examples of the knowledges that they were trying to reclaim. I kept getting on for time. So another amazing project with people who helped me in designing different aspects of ambassadors. This is Sean Angeles and Lofty Katagarincha at the Helena Rautuvia Museum in Finland. We went over there to assess an incredible collection, which was more than 120 years old or so at the time, from Hermannsburg, and set it up as a project where we were able to sort of demonstrate an early example of the exhibition ambassadors and use it as this book project called, which ended up being called Objects Collecting People. And the film of that has actually been getting a lot of traction, being screened in different parts, different film festivals around the world at the moment. It's taken on an incredibly different life of itself. But, you know, I've noticed, especially in the last couple of years, the conversations around the idea of repatriation and cultural autonomy and self-determination. We can look to so many examples where Australia has set the world standard. I mean, we can look back to the 1970s and the Tasmanian Aboriginal Cultural Centre, who started so much of the process of what we use today when we're undertaking repatriation. But museums, especially museums that are engaging with their colonial histories, for example, are learning. And, you know, it just seems to be this project which is gaining so much momentum. But an important part of the work that I did too was not just about taking and, you know, asking and, you know, a one-way street. It was always a two-way street. So I felt incredibly proud of my work to be able to volunteer with also organizations like ANCAR, Association of Northern Kimberley Arts Centres. I volunteered at least 2 of their AGMs, and over the 3 years, this is from the last year's project. Actually, no, it's this year. This is 2021, before the recent lockdowns. It was incredible to be able to get out and do that before spending all this time at home this year. And, you know, their understanding of how they manage one of the largest outdoor art galleries, like, you know, a museum without walls, which exists in Kakadu. You know, they have 3 rangers who look after about 5,000 sites, which have hundreds of paintings in each site. You know, it's similar to having, you know, 3 curators looking after the Louvre. You know, there's just so much more that we need to be doing. And I think museums are really great at starting these conversations. And, you know, the networks are just an crucial part of doing this work. So this is another one that I was on earlier this year, the Wesfarmers Indigenous Arts Leadership Program, which is run by the National Gallery of Australia. These networks that we're building to, you know, share knowledge amongst ourselves and amongst each other are just so important and need to be supported even more, because it's certainly not about acting in isolation in the same way that community don't speak on behalf of culture without authority. You know, I mean, curators don't speak on behalf of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community as well. You know, we need to draw on our friendships and our networks and our different sort of experiences and histories that we bring to our projects to give them that sense of momentum that they need to really take them into the next level that they need to be developed into. Which brings me to my second final project. I think I'm really running out of time, so give me a shout out if you need me to wind up for the Q&A or anything. But the amazing outcomes that you saw at Chow Chak Wing Museum were, in a lot of cases, just reiterations of those amazing conversations that I'd been so fortunate to sit on the sidelines. Cornell Aussies, who works at the university, and Professor Lynn Riley were early touchstones, I guess, in terms of testing ideas and taking them further. I'll get into that a little bit further because I'm just trying to move through it quickly. Ambassadors was also about embassies. It's also associated to the artist Richard Bell's project, the Aboriginal Embassy, which he's toured around the world. And it's not about recreating the tent embassy of 1971. It's about setting up an embassy for contemporary conversations to take place. So with the 8 ambassadors, which ended up being the permanent exhibitions at the museum, you there was 100 objects across 8 display cases. In each case where those conversations took place about the contemporary exhibitions which we were designing, we built the idea that the embassy was to be involved in object selection and helping me find contemporary names for these objects. Hopefully in many stages being brought into the public programming associated with the future of that exhibition. There was all sorts of ways that we were building in a community voice. So you can see it in so many of the different outcomes. This is like just a brief overview of some of the art center conversations which took place. But I really want to bring it back to Professor Lynn Riley, actually, because it was one of her exhibitions in 2016, I think, at the Macleay Museum with her kangaroo skin cloaks, where Professor Lynn Riley and Diane McNoe Riley gave us an important starting point for that idea of ambassadors. It was about seeing Linda Burney step up in Parliament that time, speaking the Wiradjuri language, wearing one of Lynn's cloaks. Not long after that exhibition came down, that I just saw this incredible power of art. And Lynn's done a lot of research in terms of reclaiming cloak making technology, but also she builds people's life story into the way that the objects the designs which are put onto them. They're not just abstract artistic depictions, they're actually biographies that she retells through symbolism and through conversations and through talking. And it was a very early way that we built this interpretive layer into the ambassadors. So Professor Linda Burney's maiden speech in Parliament was used as text on the labels, rather than a curatorial statement by myself. There were ways that we were able to use historical moments that took place in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community during the consultation process and build that into the interpretive layer of the way that the exhibitions themselves were put together. Which brings me back to slowly ending up, I guess. I mean, those early projects like working with Westmead Hospital and other, and the smoking ceremonies which took place during the repatriation project were an incredible piece of feedback, which was also given to us by the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, into how important it was to start this new building process and to welcome the objects from many nations across Australia into the new museum space. There were smoking ceremonies that took place in the storerooms, which was incredible to see. And then there was smoking ceremonies which took place in the empty building, and then smoking ceremonies which took place in the new empty storerooms before objects were transported in there. There was this important sort of process of cultural care that was built into the way that we started, from day one. And that was also represented in the outdoor ceremonial space, which was designed in feedback from our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander consultative group that we worked with, as being an incredibly important way of engaging, not just between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations of Australia and, welcoming people onto country at the University of Sydney, but also an incredibly important way of speaking First Nations to First Nations with international audiences too. There was a jar built to house the smoking ceremony ashes, and which is added to at different smoking ceremonial events. In some ways we designed these new protocols about the cultural practices like smoking ceremonies as important parts of being a museum, and not just being a museum as a static space, but being as a museum where a community can practice culture as part of their engagement and use of the museum, not just as audiences, but as a vital part of the museum's policies and protocols. So you can see the spaces that the collections that went into. These are another few shots of the different sort of smoking ceremonies which took place, which I thought was an incredibly profound moment to actually see. We also worked with other community members who were given us by the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. So Uncle James Smith, the Wiradjuri man, who also doing walking tours across the university campus, was involved in helping select and position these representations of rock engravings. You know, one of the greatest stories of Sydney that's untold is the huge outdoor art galleries that exist all across the coastline. You know, and hopefully this was a bit of a signal to future research in terms of exploring parts of Sydney that aren't known by community members and giving them a signal about the directions that future research should take. And to go full circle, you know, not only was Jeffrey a great mentor when I worked at Bumali and, you know, helped out with the education program throughout over a number of years from the very early days, and even in the last couple of years of the Macleay Museum, he was working on curriculum work and things like that. But he's done some amazing works, and to just use a simple thing of using his artistic skills to help redraw the language maps, which are depicted on the interpretive labels for the ambassador cases, for example, was for me one of the most incredible ways of keeping that conversation going, because it's not about just having a conversation once and walking away. You need to keep, you know, reassuring people and letting them know that their voice is important. I think we're winding right up, so you'll have to go see the exhibition to get a better sense of the way that we were able to sort of bring community members back into it. These are some photos of the Murakapuni exhibition, which was done over several consultations with community members who were performing at the Seymour Centre. Incredibly fortunate example of taking advantage of those opportunities when community in town. And then I went up to visit them in Tiwi and tested out new ideas. We laid out these big A4 photographs of all the objects, and they helped, gave me some really valuable lessons about, like I was talking about earlier with language. It's the Thumpapia exhibition. And I guess just to reiterate one final point about the ambassadors, it was not about putting everything in one exhibition space, because I've seen conversations about that where it was about, you know, mixing up language groups. And, you know, there's some associations there about the history of missions and reserves. So, you know, to start from a single object and, you know, to check with community members, should this go in the same case, meant that the assemblages, which turned into each of the individual ambassadors, sort of spoke for themselves in that way. You know, in this case, to meet with Philip and Nephi Denham through the Girangan Arts Centre and the incredible facilitation of Joanne Russo, who helped me incredibly when I was up there. You know, meeting contemporary makers of these shields, which were acquired in 1888. And to, you know, to see the living culture connected to them was just so important, and something that I think helps shape so much of what we of what the ambitions of the show were. Just some more examples of the incredible ambassadors that helped over the years. This is Tina Baum, who was the Larrakia Gawala Daranaki exhibition. You know, and to insert these exhibitions into other exhibitions and to sort of give them that breathing space throughout the museum in conversation with other exhibitions of material culture from people all around the world. I think it was one of the things that I just felt so proud of being able to bring into the story of how the exhibition came together. I'm really running out of time there, so I just wanted to lastly end up on the way that that was also translated into the very recent show, which unfortunately closed just last week, but is still available through the shop, and the incredible work that we did with the Yolnu communities, which we've done other programs you can find online to talk about some of the ways that we engaged with the Yolngu people and the long-term project dating all the way back to before Dr. Kumbula, for example. And the story of that is also an incredibly important way that we were able to apply a lot of those things that I was learning through in the Ambassadors exhibition, for example, into a much deeper cross-cultural experience. So you can see an example here of how just working with the Yolngu elders, Yalpi Yinapingu and Mr. Marika. Sorry, I've just gone through so many names today. I'm starting to lose it. It's been a long week. They helped us, they guided us in terms of how this whole exhibition was actually laid out, and the final product you can actually see in the exhibition space there. It was really important to bring that story out in that way. And yeah, just one last shot there. So you can see that with that. Look, I'm sorry, I think I've gone a little bit over time there. So I'm not sure if we have any times for questions or anything, but I might just leave it there.
Matt, I have never heard you say so much about your own work, because I think as everybody in the audience knows, you usually are very reticent to say anything about what you do, and very forward with promoting the works of other people, which you've also done tonight. So thank you very much. And for everybody here, please join me in thanking Matt for his spectacular talk. A number of people might need to leave. We might just continue for those who are interested. A couple of questions, please put them in the chat, or raise your hand as you'd like to, if you have any questions. You might get off scot-free, Matt. You never know.
Okay. It has been a big day, yeah.
It is. I would just like to share a point about some of the push and pull of a curator in your position, where there are things that the museum wants and has to have in certain deadlines, and there are the constant needs, as you said, the reciprocity of, if you're asking somebody to help you, you have to help them back. You cannot just say, oh no, but I need this for the museum and that's all I'm going to do. And I know that that was something that really pushed and pulled you through your time at the museum, and as you've said here, was really something that helped you in every way. It didn't matter what the thing was that you were doing, whether it's moving the wonderful artworks of various people that you knew, or helping make tea, or whatever it happened to be. That reciprocity is something that, and I guess the question is, to what extent do you think that is something that all museums really need to factor into the work of a curator who's working with Indigenous communities? How much time is the work, and how much time is the work that actually acknowledges that reciprocity that we need to do?
Yeah, look, and I certainly couldn't have done it without the sort of generosity of those mornings coming in late, and some different sort of things where it might not have looked like I was sort of just out at an opening or something like that, but it was, always returning the favor. Because I don't know, yeah, where I sort of got that sense from, but I think that comes back to everyone just being so generous with me, and there were so many times where people could have chosen not to show any interest in the things that we were doing or the programs, using their own resources and networks and getting on the phones, that I just couldn't not help them by attending their events. I think that was like why I liked volunteering with places like Ankar and all those other sort of projects which I ended up in, which I certainly didn't seek out in some sort of ways, but they became natural extensions of doing the work that I was doing as a curator. And I think museums are recognizing that in a different sort of way. I think everyone, Indigenous and non-Indigenous curators, realizes the sort of the extra legwork that you put into putting yourself out there to work, to yeah, I'm trying to think of the right words. It's not an outcome. It's just doing justice to the object, because they really do need that. You know, when you explore all the different tangents of an object story and the different people who've held it over the years, and, you know, to think of those future generations who will hold it too, you know, the more, not value, but the more sort of story you can pack into that object. That's where where I'd seen it, that had happened before through people like Rose and different sort of people like that, and the notes that she'd left on different sort of collections, because it's actually really difficult to take up as a curator someone else's curatorial work. You know, you really need to find that voice yourself. And I think a lot of what I was doing was just trying to find that voice myself, because it's such an important way of feeling comfortable in what you're doing. Because there are other times I just went home, you know, shook my head at my desk, like, you know, what have I done? You know, what am I doing? You know, and when you get corrected on something, I think you've really got to, you know, be, you know, really take it on the chin and go, yep, no, yeah, that's right. You know, I was just in the dark there, because yeah, you know, you sort of learn to be, you know, not take things as personal at all, because at the end of the day, there's a much bigger picture that you're working towards when you're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander material culture. And yeah, I think that's the sort of the bigger picture that kept me going through those times when I might have been flying blind a little bit.
Well, I know how much of an influence the people that you worked with at Bamali had in terms of not just your curatorial work, but also people like Jeffrey Samuels just making sure that you were on the right track for such a long time, and to help you and to work with you, be willing to always be there. And I think that's also a marker of your generosity and reciprocity. So thank you for doing all of that with the museum. Lorraine had a comment about how much different is your current work to the kinds of work that you were doing at Bamali and indeed at the Macleay and Chow Chak Wing.
Yeah, I like throwing myself in the deep end, and I'm learning all these new maritime puns that I can't escape from. No, I think especially the ambassadors and the Jalkari sort of set me up for, you know, the national collections that we're working with at the Australian National Maritime Museum, because it's such a bigger story to tell. And, you know, it's a different entry point. I mean, we're having these great conversations at the moment about, you know, it's not just acknowledging country. And, you know, once again, it's those same Yolnu artists, for example, who are leading the way with their sea right spark paintings, for example. You know, so how do we acknowledge coastlines? How do we acknowledge rivers? You know, the land rights movement has done so much for, you know, acknowledging country and acknowledging land. But as we're moving into these new areas, you know, offshores and in waters and different sort of things like that, I mean, once again, I'm just going back to the drawing board and starting again, thinking, okay, well, how do we actually approach this history of not just activism, but, you know, asserting their agency into the story that, you know, a museum is trying to tell. But, you know, I grew up on beaches too, so I do like the water. And yeah, I've found a newfound love for some very old passions. So hopefully we'll be able to connect those to some of the places that I want to visit and the communities I want to work with in different parts of the country. So yeah, it is back to the drawing board in a little bit. But I guess that, you know, that's gratitude. Yeah, I know.
Well, mainly all of the comments that have come in are for you. So I think we might end there, give you a couple of minutes to read through everybody's comments and their thanks for working with you over this past 10 years or so. So thanks again. I don't know if we can mute, but I will do on behalf of everyone.
That's okay.
No,
thanks everyone for joining in. I really appreciate it. And can't wait to see you all in person again sometime too.